Welcome back, sports fans. Another episode of the Brew and Shaver Sports Podcast. We have two games left in the regular season before we launch into the new 12-team playoff, which we'll talk about it in a little bit. Some controversy there with the playoffs. But first of all, let's start off by congratulating former LSU great Paul Skenes, who today was named National League Rookie of the Year. Great honor to a great player representing the SEC. We see that in every professional sports league, SEC players. Maybe not,
Absolutely.
maybe not so much the NHL or MLS, but
But there might come a time when it's MLS, probably before NHL. There seems to be a lot more soccer now than there used to be
yeah.
in the SEC. So,
Well, let's talk about this past week's action. Let's jump right in with our three takeaways. Darren, what's your first takeaway from this past weekend?
well, we talked about South Carolina last week and about them getting a lot of conversation and attention about being the team that no one wants to face. And could they live up to it? Could they actually continue on that path and grow into that? And yeah, they did well this week. Let's say it that way against Missouri, a win over a ranked Missouri team, and they did it in a way that maybe people weren't necessarily talking about it. There had been a lot of conversation about Rocket Sanders, about what Lenore Sellers could do with his feet, and then here comes the Missouri game where Lenore Sellers is 21 of 30, 353 yards, five touchdowns, and one interception, showing that he could do it with his feet. Now, the 353 yards is a little bit of an anomaly, or do it with his arm, not his feet, sorry. The 353 yards is a little bit of an anomaly for it to be that high. But if you go back and look through the last five games, even with one of those games being a loss, he's thrown for 230, almost 240 yards plus four of those last five games. He's had at least two touchdowns in the air in four of the last five games, and only one interception in two games, including this past week. That was he had that one interception in the Missouri game. So South Carolina and this offense have now shown they can hit you on the ground and they can hit you in the air. And basically, what we're now seeing, and I heard someone talking about South Carolina today say, I feel like I'm watching this team grow up before my eyes, seeing what they can do, how they can do it. So I just want to very quickly, last week I threw out a lot of numbers, so I'm going to throw out a few more numbers very quickly, a little bit more specific about this game and the things they accomplished either that culminated in this game or during this game. Lenore Sellers in the last five games has 13 touchdowns and two interceptions. They have the South Carolina team has scored in the last 2 minutes of the first half in four of the last five games. Three of those four have been touchdowns. They put up 462 yards against a Missouri defense that was only allowing just under 300 yards a game. The 353 passing yards is the second most allowed by Missouri defense in the last 5 years. So only one other team has done that. And Lenore, this is an amazing stat. Lenore Sellers had five touchdown passes against this Missouri defense, and they had only allowed seven touchdown passes the entire season before this game Saturday night against South Carolina. And the 453 total yards, or their total yards of all 462, total yards is, I'm going to say that one more time. Sorry, I threw that one off in 15 different ways. The 353 yards by Lenore Sellers is the most yards a Missouri defense has allowed by one QB in a game in the last 9 years. One more thing, the only one interception during the game. This South Carolina team under Shane Beamer is 23-6. That's a 739 winning percentage. When they are ahead or finish even in a game in the turnover battle. So as long as they finish even or win the turnover battle, it's a 739 winning percentage. Now, eh, that's kind of a duh moment. Well, yeah, if you win the turnover battle, you win the game. But think about that. At a 739 clip, that's a pretty impressive winning percentage to say as long as you finish even or win the playoff or the turnover battle, 23 and 6, a 739 winning percentage. I am blown away by what we have seen this South Carolina team do. They started off winning 2 games, went on a 3-game skid, and now are on an absolute 4-game hot streak. And I got to tell you, they play Wofford this week. Surely to goodness, that's a win. If I'm Clemson, I am very, very concerned about what this team is going to look like rolling into that game at the end of the season. This is an impressive South Carolina team, and I think from a Clemson perspective, South Carolina absolutely is a team that they don't want to face and that they don't want to see at the end of their season. I think that's going to be a very, very pivotal game for this South Carolina team and for the Clemson team as well. And South Carolina has grown into that role over the process of what will be then the last 5 games. Very impressive what Shane Beamer and this Gamecock team is doing.
That's a good takeaway. They are certainly peaking at the right time.
Absolutely.
That unfortunate loss to LSU is
Yep.
haunting them right now, but definitely a very tough team playing at a high level.
Absolutely. What's your first takeaway, Ben?
I want to talk a little bit about the SEC title. We talked about already in a previous episode is up for grabs, but right now with 2 games left in the season, Texas 5-1 in the conference, A&M 5-1, Georgia 6-2, Tennessee 5-2, Alabama 4-2, Ole Miss 4-2. Those are the legitimate teams that actually have a shot. Now a lot has to happen for some of those teams. Again, if Texas wins out, they control their own destiny. I think the same thing for A&M, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Ole Miss. They're going to need a little bit of help. But what an incredible matchup now this Texas and Texas A&M game is looking to be on November 30th. Assuming both Texas and A&M win this weekend, that sets up this colossal matchup in which the winner's going to the 12-team playoff and the loser is most likely not going to that 12-team playoff, especially with Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Ole Miss. They're lurking in the shadows. They're knocking on the door. Now, one of the reasons why we're having this discussion and the questioning whether Georgia, a team like Georgia, belongs in the 12-team playoff is because of how the system has been set up. Other people have pointed this out. If you go back to some of the discussions about the 12-team playoff, strength of schedule was supposed to be a huge factor. They wanted to prevent teams from playing a cupcake schedule and getting to say, hey, we're 10-0, so we belong in the playoff. Whereas the SEC, for example, as a conference, most teams in the SEC will play a top 25 team. They'll play 4 or 5 of those in the course of a season. So I think there's some questions there, and I'm going to get into that later when we talk about our brown bag about particulars of scheduling. But right now, it boggles my mind that Georgia may be on the outside looking in. They're such a strong team. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But kudos to the SEC schedulers for putting Texas and Texas A&M as the final regular season game. And thank you for doing it after Thanksgiving so families can enjoy, fans from both teams can enjoy a Thanksgiving meal before they're screaming at their teams and talking trash to each other.
Those are some great points, and just how, like you said, we've talked about before, how just crazy this whole year has been in the SEC, and you already had it kind of, you knew it was going to be a little crazy with college football playoff, that there was going to be some ups and downs just because who's in, who's out, but then when you add to that just how all over the place the wins and losses have been in the conference this year, really has made for an incredible year.
How about your second takeaway?
Well, I'm going to say a little bit more about what you just said. You were talking about, I want to put a couple of the specific scenarios in place. Um, if if Texas wins out, like you said, that is a Texas is definitely one of the teams in. If A&M wins out, they are definitely one of the teams in. As of right now, if the season ended today, Alabama is the second team. They would play whoever wins between Texas and Texas A&M. Again, assuming that both of them win their games this coming week. The interesting thing about that is Alabama is teetering on the edge of giving Auburn the chance to play the biggest spoiler in the world. Because if Alabama, or if Auburn rather, can pull off the upset against Alabama, that knocks them out of the championship game, and then at that point places Georgia in the championship game, which goes to what you were just talking about Georgia being on the outside looking in, because that puts Georgia even in a more precarious spot. Because if they make it to you would assume the way the committee is doing things right now, if that happens, Auburn spoils everything, beats Alabama. Alabama is knocked out of the conference championship. You would assume most likely knocked out of the college football playoff. Georgia has to win, because if Georgia loses that SEC championship game and becomes a three-loss team, they kind of seal their own fate. So they would actually, as weird as this is going to sound, Georgia's probably going to be some pretty big Alabama fans because that puts them in a really tough spot. Now, on the other side of that, they go to the SEC championship game, their fate's in their own hands. So they go in, they play Texas or Texas A&M, they win that game, which as we've seen, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a little bit, some of the things they're doing now, the way they look this past week against Tennessee, they look like a team that could pull that off, depending on what kind of night either a Texas or a Texas A&M have. But it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out, because, as you said, you would assume whoever ends up in that spot against Texas or Texas A&M, who seem the most likely to get in, is in a really, really tough spot. You better win, or you come out of that championship game a three-loss team that went in thinking you might have a shot at the playoff, and guaranteeing not only will you not have an SEC championship, but you're not going to get in the playoff with three losses. The percentages are as close to absolutely impossible as they can be, and that's a really tough spot for either Alabama, Georgia, whoever it ends up being, to be in. It's going to be really interesting how it all plays out.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts there. How about your next takeaway?
Well, actually, that was my next takeaway.
Oh, okay.
I was just adding on to yours. So, what about your second takeaway?
Okay. I want to give some good news before I get to the bad news, and some good news with SEC players in national rankings. When it comes to passing nationally, Jackson Dart is third. I think it's just the Cam Ward from Miami and McCord up at Syracuse are ahead of him in terms of passing yardage. But Jackson Dart still having a stellar season, should be in the Heisman Trophy conversation. Garrett Nussmeier, who's taken a lot of heat, particularly here in Louisiana, for this 3-game losing streak that the Tigers are on. He's still 7th in the country in passing yardage. And Carson Beck barely missed out on the top 10. He's 11th. Came off a great game last week against Tennessee. That Tennessee defense didn't sack him a single time, which is a testament to Georgia's offensive line and their preparation. But when you get to the rushing side of things, Tennessee fans, you got a lot to celebrate. Dylan Sampson is 6th in the country in rushing, had over 100 yards against that Georgia defense, still doing great. Auburn, you've got something to celebrate. I know it's been a really rough season, but you've got the 19th ranked rusher in terms of yardage in Jarquez Hunter. When it goes to the receiving side of the ball, we'd expect someone from Ole Miss to be in the top 10, and that is Trey Harris, who's ranked fifth. He's had some injuries, he's missed some games. And on 11th, just barely missing the top 10 in receiving yardage, is Andrew Armstrong from Arkansas. A little surprising there, but testament to Arkansas and the season Armstrong's having. Well, let's also go to the defensive side of the ball. And let's talk about our national leaders when it comes to most tackles. And we've got a bunch, four from the SEC in our top 15. Isaac Smith from Mississippi State, 101 tackles. Kid's only a sophomore. So Mississippi State, I know it's been a rough season, but there's a bright spot moving forward. Danny Stutzman, the outstanding linebacker from Oklahoma, 96 tackles. He's 13th overall. Unfortunately, Sooner fans, he's a senior. He won't be back. Joining Isaac Smith from Mississippi State in the top 15 is Stone Blanton, a junior for the Bulldogs, 92 tackles. So you've got two linebackers that most likely will be back next season. That's a great foundation. And tied with Blanton for 15th overall ranking with 92 tackles is a sophomore from LSU linebacker, Whit Weeks. What about sacks? What about the big guys up front? How's the SEC doing? Well, they've got the fifth top sacker. He doesn't work at a grocery store. He pursues the quarterback. Kyle Kennard, South Carolina, part of that strong defensive line that the Gamecocks have had this year. He's got 10.5 sacks. He's a senior. This is last year. Over at Ole Miss, you have the Perkins kid with 10 sacks. You've got Princely Yuma Namelin. I'm sorry for mispronouncing that name. I don't intend to. He's a senior. He's got 9.5 sacks. And then from LSU, senior Braden Swinson with 8 sacks. So some bright spots, and particularly I wanted to point out the two linebackers from Mississippi State, because I know those fans in Starkville have had such a rough season. But I see a lot of hope on the horizon for that Bulldogs program. And when you look at players like this who are forming that nucleus that is part of the program that Jeff Lebby is building, you've got some reason for optimism.
Absolutely, man. Those are some great stats. It's awesome, and I think it goes to the point the case we make on a week in and week out basis of just how strong this conference is. When you see just how many stat leaders, national stat leaders, there are that come out of this conference.
Yeah. How about your third takeaway?
Well, you brought up Georgia and Carson Beck, and I want to give some kudos to Carson Beck because he has just a little bit taken it on the chin the last 4 weeks basically in a pretty big way, and he corrected course in the game against Tennessee Saturday night. He had 347 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. It's his first game in 5 games without throwing an interception, and only his second game in 6 that he didn't throw an interception. But he had a QB rating of 151, threw 2 touchdowns, 347 yards, and contributed with his feet with 32 yards and a touchdown. So kudos to him for figuring out whatever it was that he needed to figure out, because we've talked about him before and how obviously he didn't forget how to throw a football. He didn't forget how to be a quarterback. There was just something going on. So very impressive that he did that. But also, as we've talked about, a lot of times the O-line doesn't get credit that they deserve. And so we want to highlight and spotlight that Georgia offensive line because, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, not a single sack allowed against a very good Tennessee defense. There were very few pass rushes throughout the process of the entire night. They did not get to him, whether it be through 4-man rush or even through bringing additional rushers. There were times when they brought 5, even 6. They still did not get to Carson Beck. And one of the things, because Carson Beck has been out in the forefront with so much attention because of the interceptions, one of the things that won't get talked about that I wanted to make sure that we brought out was there were some internal moves made on the offensive line, specifically the move from left tackle to right tackle of Monroe Freeling. And then there were some other adjustments made. And I think you could see, even though there wasn't not a Trevor Etienne that was on the field, they're deep on the bench in their running back. They were still able to get some rushing yards. Again, even opened up some space for Carson Beck to have some rushing yards, and they protected him all night long, at least for that night. And what Tennessee was bringing to the table, the changes that were made were a positive thing for the Georgia offensive line. They protected their quarterback, and he was able to sit comfortably. And he didn't do a whole lot different. He still threw into some tight spots that they're probably talking about in the film room the last couple of days. But he had the time to see them and get the ball where he wanted it to be, to finish his throw, to not be rushed, to step into it, to make sure all of those mechanics were right. And I think it made a world of difference. And very obviously, they had 347 yards, 2 touchdowns. So kudos to Carson Beck for figuring some things out, but also kudos to the Georgia coaching staff and the offensive staff for making the changes that needed to be done on the offensive line, and kudos to that offensive line for the protection they offered all night long. It was definitely a different looking offense than you would say had been the previous couple of weeks, for sure.
Yeah, great stats. If Georgia wins out, I don't know how you keep them out of the 12-team playoff,
Yeah, agree.
especially with that last game being against Georgia Tech,
Yep,
who just beat Miami,
yep,
who's ranked pretty high and expected to be in that playoff.
yep. What's your third takeaway, or is that
Well, I'm
right?
going
Yeah.
to talk a little bit more about the slide in LSU and Baton Rouge. We saw a lot this past weekend. A disappointing loss to Florida.
Mm-hmm.
A head coach screaming at a player on the sideline. Another player screaming at the head coach on the sideline. And I know Brian Kelly went on Feinbaum today and tried to smooth that out. It was, heat of the moment. Those guys want the ball. And that's really good for him to handle it that way. But it was disconcerting to see nonetheless. Also disconcerting are some of these stats. LSU's been outscored in the last 10 quarters, 100-35. They've had 27 drives, only 3 touchdowns. They've given up 11 sacks in the last 3 games. Those are stats that came from Zach Nagy. Jason Starrett shared that Kelly is the 4th LSU coach to lose 3 straight games in a season since 1999. The other ones, Coach O, 2021, he was fired. Les Miles in 2015, he was fired in 2016. And Jerry DiNardo in 1999, he was fired that same season. Wilson Alexander shares some of these LSU national rankings. When it comes to where they rank nationally in scoring, they're 57th. Yards per play, 52nd. Turnovers lost, they're tied for 62nd. Red zone touchdown percentage, 76%. Rushing yards per game, they are ranked 114th nationally. A consecutive streak ended this past weekend. Brian Kelly, going back to his time at Notre Dame, had amassed 7 straight seasons of 10 or more wins. That will officially come to an end this season. Now, is there any silver lining in all this? Well, there's a lot being put on this recruiting class. If they can maintain the commitments from these players, and we're getting into the stretch run then, so other schools are going to be coming at these guys, making offers, trying to steer them away. That's cause for optimism if they can maintain that class. Another cause for optimism comes from history. If you go back to Nick Saban's career at LSU, his 3rd season at the helm, the Tigers finished a disappointing 8-5. So all is not lost. I know people are calling for Brian Kelly to be on the hot seat, and I think the seat should be hot because the expectations are high. But I think we need to step back for a second and realize, hey, Nick Saban, the greatest coach ever in college football, was 8-5 his 3rd year at LSU. So maybe temper those expectations and believe in the process, and let's see where we go from here. a lot can change quickly. You've mentioned South Carolina. They had some disappointing losses. Now, as you said, I don't think anybody in the country wants to play South Carolina.
Oh,
So you keep believing in the process. This isn't just for LSU fans. This is for Mississippi State fans. This is for Florida fans. This is for all those programs that are struggling to finally break back into meet the expectations that they have.
and I agree with you. Temper it. Be calm, see what the program brings, but also at the same time, Brian Kelly, you have got to figure a way to stop getting your name on lists that include Jerry DiNardo. That's got to stop. There's nothing positive that comes from your career if you keep getting on that kind of list. That's got to cut out.
Feinbaum, I think, referred to LSU being a total mess in
Mm,
his analysis of this past weekend. But kudos to Brian Kelly every Monday, regardless of what happens. And they haven't won a game in over a month. You got to go back to the Arkansas game.
wow, wow,
He
what a
he
sentence.
still he still shows up and has that interview with Feinbaum. So he's not running from this. He's not hiding.
Yep,
So kudos to him for facing the music as they go through this difficult time.
absolutely. Great point. Great point. Great take.
Well, it's time to move on to our 4 down territory, in which we look at a couple of things from this past weekend. We give our infamous Brown Bag Award, and we showcase a particular coach's post-game quote before we focus on the upcoming weekend with the sure thing pick and the upset pick of the weekend. So, looking back on this past weekend, Darren, who receives your brown bag?
Well, some people might consider this low hanging fruit, but whether it is or not, I'm going to roll with it. I'm going to give my brown bag. Let's see, I think we're what are we 3 weeks into the college football playoff, given their top 25. So I think if you look at it throughout the entire process, the criteria being used, some of the teams that have been in there, some of the teams that have been out, when you look at that top 12, I understand it's the first year, but there seems to be some things that we can't seem to get right that shouldn't be the case. And so the college football playoff committee, I'm going to throw you a brown bag. I'm hoping it's something that you get corrected throughout the process, the rest of the season, hopefully. But for right now, that's going to be my brown bag. How about you?
I'm going out of conference for my brown bag, and I'm giving it to the Big Ten. A friend of ours that has been on the show in the past, Buckeye Doug, sent me the rankings from one of the polls, and he said, "Look, there's 4 out of 5 of the top teams are Big Ten teams."
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute and why Feinbaum is exactly right when he talks about how messed up the scheduling is. The argument is typically used, well, we only can play who's on our schedule. I mean, they're in our conference, we can play them. But what you can control is the out of conference games that you play, which means if you want to be taken seriously, play serious games
Mm-hmm.
against good programs from major conferences.
Absolutely.
If we're going to start playing this game of we're going to play a easy schedule so we can get into the playoffs, that this is going to ruin the 12-team playoff. So here's some examples of what I'm talking about. Penn State, all year they've only played one top 10 team and they lost to that team. They've only played one top 20 team. That was Illinois at the time. So 2 teams in their entire schedule. What week are we in? Think about it. 2 teams that were in the top
12
20.
weeks. Yeah.
Indiana has only played one top 10 team, and that will be this Saturday when they play Ohio State. But you turn on the radio and Indiana's the darling right now. Look at this. What they just signed their coach to an 8-year contract extension. They're giving their fans information about how to get playoff tickets. They
Yep.
haven't played anybody until this
Exactly.
weekend. Ohio State has played uh, 3 top 10 teams. Yes, they lost to Oregon, they beat Penn State, and they play Indiana this week. So that's respectable. That's
Mm-hmm.
respectable. I can. So Buckeye Doug, I'll give you that one. The
Yeah.
Buckeyes, that's 3, so that's respectable. Oregon has only played one top 10 team. Ohio State, they won that game, plus Illinois. So the top teams in the Big Ten, the schedules are incredibly weak. You don't have to stop at the Big Ten. You can go to the ACC and make the
Mm-hmm.
same argument when you look at
Absolutely.
Miami's schedule. And my goodness gracious, where on the other side in the SEC, teams typically play 4 to 5 top 20 teams in their regular season schedule. You've
Absolutely.
got to give more weight. We've seen this before in the BCS. We've seen teams try to find loopholes around the system by, oh, if it's really about wins and losses, let's schedule the easiest schedule that we can do. Maybe throw in one top 20 team and hopefully we get that victory and we sneak in. You can make the argument about Notre Dame. Yes, they played at A&M. That was a big win, but A&M just got a brand new coach. They're going through a transition period. But yeah,
Yeah.
it was still a big win. But
Mm-hmm.
other than that, when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, who else is in the top 20?
Exactly.
Navy? Really?
Yeah.
And you got beat by Northern Illinois University.
Exactly.
That's great you haven't lost since then, but we've got to get a handle on this, or we're going to see a corrupted 12-team playoff system, which
Absolutely.
means if teams play these schedules, they're going to wind up in the playoff. They're going to meet a superior opponent. It's going to be a blowout, and no
Yeah.
college football fan wants to see blowouts in the playoffs.
Exactly. That's a great point.
Well, let's move on to the post-game quote of the week. Darren, what you got?
Well, I feel like, and this has not been by intent, it's just kind of the things that have stood out. Showing a little bit of a salty side of some of the coaches has been our trend the last couple of weeks. And I didn't really think about it until after I had selected this one. But, you know, coaches have to be very careful about how they respond to questions about officiating, the answers they give, the words they say, because obviously the office is watching. And Josh Huepel found himself in an interesting situation toward the end of the press conference of being asked about. He was specifically asked about the face mask call, and then he brought up the 12 man on the field. And it was interesting how he brought those up. So I just wanted to let's see how after a very disappointing loss, how Coach Huepel deals with being asked about officiating in the game.
Man, I have no idea, man. All I know is this league, this college football, is good as it gets. Like, it is. Teams get beat on the road sometimes. It's hard to win, man. In this league, it's a good football team that we just played. Yeah. They've lost a couple of close ones on the road against good football teams. You know, I had turnovers in that game. It's a good football team. We're a good football team, too.
Josh, a follow-up on the face mask. When we watched the replay,
Yeah, what did it look like?
It looked like the back of the helmet popped off. You didn't see a hand on the face mask. There was an explanation.
Can you repeat that?
It looked like his helmet popped off. There wasn't a hand. SEC office. Next question. Did they give you an explanation of why it was called?
Next question.
Anything else for Coach?
You want to ask about the 12 men on the field?
I would, yeah.
Okay.
I forgot to give him credit. I got so caught up in the officiating when he is asked, "Hey, what do you got? How do you feel about you guys where you are in the college football playoff?" Man, I don't know. Have you seen how good the quality of football is? That's a good team. We're a good team. He gave some really honest and, like I said, tended toward maybe a little bit towards salty. I think maybe that was just kind of the mood he was in after a disappointing loss. But some creative and interesting answers on his part in that few minutes.
Yeah, he did well. That was such a disappointing loss for
Yeah.
Tennessee fans.
Yeah.
Georgia played a great game. That was two great teams, really, when you
Absolutely.
look at it. And
Absolutely.
I think both of them should be in the 12-team playoff, but I
Yep.
don't make that call. But yeah, it
Agree.
had to be disappointing. But Huepel handled it very, very well.
Yep.
Let's move on for this upcoming week, and let's talk about our sure thing pick. Darren, who's your can't miss? They are going to win, no questions.
Well, I think I am going to, because it's not a big game, even though he's shown he can do it. I think I'm going to go with Lane Kiffin and the Ole Miss Rebels against Florida. Florida's got a lot of positive heat right now, coming off the unfortunate win over LSU. But they seem to be doing some things right. DJ Lagway showed that he can win with his arm. He didn't have a single rushing yard. They were still protecting that hamstring, and they showed that they can do some things. However, I feel like this is an Ole Miss team that will take care of whatever Florida wants to bring to the table and give it back to them. So I think Ole Miss is a sure thing this week. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I agree with that pick. The Ole Miss defense is better than the LSU defense. So Florida, you got to win last week. I don't think you're getting it this week.
Agree.
My pick, though, my sure thing pick is Texas over Kentucky.
Yeah.
They're going to minimize looking ahead to A&M. Kentucky's going to come to play, but it's in Austin. I think Longhorns take care of business. How about
Great
your
pick.
upset pick of the week?
You're not going to like it. I'll just go ahead and throw that out there. I looked honestly across all of these games, and so many of the spreads are so big that, the Auburn A&M game, I know that's in Auburn, and it's a tighter spread, but still A&M has such an ability to control a game right now, or that seems to be what they're showing us. So even though it's 7.5, and it wouldn't hurt my feelings if the odds makers bump that up to 10.5, because I feel like that's the one thing Vanderbilt needs, is to be a double-digit underdog. That really seems to work well. But even at 7.5, I know it's on the road. I know it's at night in Baton Rouge. It is a 6:45 game, but I got to go with Vanderbilt. That's my upset pick. Like I said, I know you're not going to like it, but I think I got to go with them this week. At least one more time as for this game. So Vanderbilt's my upset. How about you?
I'm going to go to Starkville. Mississippi State is still looking for their first conference win of the season. It's been rough this season. I think they might be able to get Missouri. Missouri's already bowl eligible. They may look at this game. What are we really playing for? We're not going to win an SEC title. We're not going to the 12-team playoff. We've already secured our place in a bowl game. Whereas Mississippi State is playing for pride. They're playing for how can we end the season on a positive note. I'm going to go with Mississippi State pulling off a big upset over the Missouri Tigers.
Great pick.
So be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button as well. We appreciate when you interact, when you subscribe, when you tell your friends about the show. New episodes typically come out sometime on Tuesday. It might be in the morning. It might be in the wee hours of around midnight, 2 in the morning the following day, but it gets out there. So
That's right.
If you subscribe, you don't have to constantly be refreshing your feed because you will receive a notification. So hit that subscribe button. It means a lot to us.
Absolutely.
Enjoy the games this weekend. And until next week, y'all take care.
Have a great week. Thank you for making the Brew and Shaver Sports Podcast your go-to sports show. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review our show if you haven't already. Your feedback is important. Let us know what you think about this week's show. Send an email to brewandshavers@gmail.com or text to our text line, 318-390-3599. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again for listening to the Brew and Shaver Sports Podcast. See you next week.